Good morning. I'm Rabbi Lustig. I'd like to welcome you to the Amram Scholar Series here at the Washington Hebrew Congregation, done in conjunction with the Jewish Book Council and under the leadership of our chair, Leslie Maitland. I want to ask you a favor, and that is if you have anything that might buzz or beep or whatever besides your pacemaker, please turn it to off. Go all the way, be radical, go all the way off, and not just to silence. American Jews, who are we? Stakeholders in white privilege, the descendants of slaves who served and escaped Pharaoh? Are we American Jews or Jewish Americans? Are we the oppressed, the object of the greatest rise of anti-Semitism in decades? Or are we the Zionist oppressors, as we are labeled on nearly every college campus in America? In the age of intersectionality, with layered identities, we must ask, who is the American Jew? This morning we will be privileged to hear how in the 18th and 19th centuries, we became the American Jew. How we became the American Jew. Stephen Weisman, journalist, author, commentator, editor, White House correspondent, puts his keen acuities together to reap from some of American Jewry's finest historians, Jacob Rader Marcus, Dr. Lance Sussman, Pam Nadell, Dr. Gary Zola, Dr. Mark Raphael, a fascinating survey of the events and personalities which give shape to the uniqueness of the American Jewish community and the American Jew. Stephen Weisman is the Vice President for Publications and Communications at Peterson Institute. He has previously been the Chief International Economics Correspondent for the New York Times. He served as a member of the editorial board of the Times, specializing in politics and economics. His work has appeared in Times book reviews, Time magazines, and the paper's news, features, culture sections since 1968. Before serving as Chief International Economic Correspondent, he was Chief Diplomatic Correspondent and won the Edward Wentall Prize. He has also covered the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and during the first term of President Reagan, Mr. Weisman was a senior White House correspondent specializing in foreign policy. He is a prolific author. He has written The Great Tax Wars, Lincoln to Wilson, The Fierce Battles Over Money, Power That Transformed the Nation. He was also an editor in the book on Daniel Patrick Moynihan, A Portrait of Letters of an American Visionary, and The Great Trade-Off, Confronting Moral Conflicts in the Era of Globalization. This morning he will speak to us on his book, The Chosen Wars, How Judaism Became an American Religion. As a student of American history and Jewish American history, this is an exciting morning for me. So I'm honored to welcome our speaker.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Lustig, for that lovely introduction. What a pleasure it is to be here, and thanks for braving the predictions of snow to come out this morning. It's an honor to be at this wonderful congregation. I've been here for bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. So it's an honor to be invited to speak about my book. I thank also Leslie Maitland for inviting me. I just wanted to tell you a story that a year ago I spoke at something called the Jewish Book Council, which is an organization that sets up authors to speak at congregations, and it was very intimidating to do that because to New York, and it was an audience of about 300 Jews from all over the country. And you get up there and you have 2 minutes to talk about your book. It was sort of like an episode from The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. But there in the crowd was one person that I knew, Leslie Maitland, a beloved colleague from the New York Times, and thank you for inviting me. So, as the rabbi said, I have this peculiar background for somebody who would write a book about Judaism and American Jewish history. I was at the New York Times for a long time. I took a buyout several years ago after working there for 40 years. I always like to say I was at the New York Times for as long as the Jews were wandering in the desert. And so let me just, before I start telling you about my book, let me talk about the first question that I'm asked, which the rabbi asked me when we met this morning, which is, why did you write this book? Why, with your background? So I grew up in Los Angeles at a wonderful Reform congregation in LA that was founded around the same time as Washington Hebrew in the middle of the 19th century and became the leading Reform congregation probably in Los Angeles. It was very associated with Hollywood in those days. The sanctuary was built in the 1920s and 1930s and supported by a lot of studio heads. And I remember when I would go to services in the front lobby of the synagogue, they had on display the actual tablets that Charlton Heston carried in. So it was a very Reform synagogue, and my journey through Hebrew school was really instigated by my best friend at the time, still my dearest friend from those years, who lived down the street. We were friends since kindergarten, and we went to studied Hebrew together. And then he went off to Harvard. I went to Yale. He graduated and had a bit of a spiritual awakening or crisis, maybe, and abruptly moved to Israel to become an Orthodox Jew at a seminary there. He still lives there. He's a pediatrician. Taking care of the Haredi community, beloved in that community, although he's modern Orthodox. And I visited him because it was such a shock to his family and friends. It was almost like a heresy to become an Orthodox Jew. So I spent some time with him in Jerusalem and in Israel, and it was really, I was in my early 20s. It was actually my first understanding of what it is to be an Orthodox Jew and to to learn the Talmud and learn all the mitzvot and what they meant and the history of them. And I have to say that it never appealed to me the way it appealed to him, but I was fascinated. I fell in love with it as a subject. And but I also was fascinated by who were the people in the modern era who decided to reject these 613 commandments and so much of what they represented. Were they arrogant? Were they revolutionaries? Were they ignorant? Who were they? So I started really in my 20s a lifelong study of the Jewish Enlightenment as well as religious history. I'm a political reporter. If you were to shake me, you would see that that's who I am. I covered elections. I love to write about political conflict. And about 15 years ago, it occurred to me that maybe I could tell the story of the birth of American Judaism, mainly in the 19th century, through the great personalities and what they were fighting about. And so that's why I started a long time ago to write this book. There were some other books that came up in between. I left the Times. I went to work for a think tank. It was always a part-time job, so it took a long time. And what I just read on my when I could, and I just realized there were a lot of great stories. The center of the book is Isaac Mayer Wise, who is regarded as the founder of Reform Judaism, but he did not see himself as championing a new kind of Judaism. Even the word reform came much later in his career. His vision was to create an American Judaism with a distinctly American feel. And if you read about Rabbi Wise, who is a brilliant visionary, but also a bit of a narcissist, he was a depressive, he was bombastic, he was just a great character. I knew he would be...
He's a good congregational rabbi.
And one of the things that he did as a congregational rabbi was fight with his congregation president. I'm sure that doesn't happen today. But what you know, the central anecdote that I love, maybe some of you know it, is that he got into such a fight with his congregation president over various practices. And he wanted to fire the kosher butcher, and there was disagreement about everything. But the big big fight that they had was over whether or not there would be a Messiah to come to rescue the Jews and deliver them back to the Holy Land and restore the temple, restore even the animal sacrifices, bring about the resurrection of the dead, and that this person would be a Jesus-like figure who would do that. For thousands of years, Jews have offered prayers and reinforcing their belief in the Messiah, and in Maimonides' 13 principles of which he developed in the 12th century of what Judaism constitutes, the belief in the Messiah was very central. And there was a big debate in South Carolina attended by Rabbi Wise about whether or not there would be a personal Messiah. And he was an observer in the debate, and he writes very humorously and rather contemptuously, actually, about the debaters. But at one point, the rabbi who was arguing in favor of the Messiah turned to Wise and said, "Do you believe in the Messiah?" And he said, "No." Why didn't he believe in the Messiah? Well, American Jews in this interval felt that they were in the promised land. They weren't going to be returned to the promised land. America was the promised land. In fact, at that synagogue, they posted the principles of Maimonides on the wall, but they left out the one on the Messiah and the resurrection of the dead. So Rabbi Wise went back to his congregation in Albany, and by then the word had gotten around of his heretical comment about the Messiah in all of the Jewish press, and that was the last straw for the congregation president. He was fired. He was fired on the eve of Rosh Hashanah. His supporters said they rejected the ouster. There were all kinds of debates about whether or not the meeting had been adjourned, and he went and sat in the congregation, and when it came time to take the Torah out of the ark, he marched up to the bima and grabbed the Torah as he had been accustomed to doing, and the president of the congregation ran up, slugged him in the face, grabbed the Torah. They got into a fist fight. The Albany police were called in. They evacuated the synagogue. They arrested Wise, marched him back to his house. And and this was the most consequential fist fight in American Jewish history. I don't think there were many, though. So, the other interesting thing about that is, coming back to the congregation in South Carolina, the interesting thing to me is that although my book focuses on this period of the 19th century, it kind of ends at the end of the 19th century. And of course, what happened at the end of the 19th century is the great influx of Jews from Central Europe and Russia, which probably most of us here, or many of us anyway, are descended from that migration. And my book proposes that although the Jews that I'm writing about numbered only about 250,000 by the 1880s, what they created was American Judaism that we are heirs to today. And interestingly, that South Carolina, which before the Civil War in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s was the largest Jewish community in the United States, they set up the first, what they called, Reformed Society for Judaism. They were afraid that the next generation would slip away, and because of the incomprehensibility of the services, so they wanted to introduce more vernacular. They wanted to make other kinds of reforms in the service. And then in the 1840s, there was a devastating fire that leveled a quarter or a third of Charleston, including several churches, and Beth Elohim, their synagogue, was razed to the ground. So they raised money to build a new synagogue. And the most revolutionary thing that they did, aside from posting 10 out of the 13 principles of Maimonides, was to install an organ. This was a shock to the traditionalists, and there was a big fight over it. And actually, parallel to this, there were fights over organs in other synagogues. And I might add, many of you probably know that there was a similar fight at Washington Hebrew in the 19th century that led to a breakaway congregation that became Addis. I think many of you know that. So the organ was a hugely controversial subject in the 19th century. And I have to admit that while I was doing the research for this, I kind of went down successive rabbit holes in reading about these controversies, and I just became fascinated by the arguments for and against an organ, both in the German-speaking countries, lands, and in the United States. Does an organ played on Shabbat violate Shabbat? What's the nature of an organ? You know, the rabbis went back and forth. Is it a sacrilege to play music on Shabbat? Some people would find passages in the Torah or the Bible where music was played on Shabbat. They went back and forth. But the organ controversy in Charleston was significant for the establishment of American Judaism, because the dissidents at the synagogue took the organ proponents to court to enforce the rule that banned an organ. And it went through a lower court decision, and then finally a Supreme Court decision in the appellate level division in South Carolina, and it's called the Charleston, Oregon case. And if you read the decision, it's really great. You know, it's just great. The most important thing about the decision, however, was the principle of the judge saying that religious practices are going to be up to each congregation, and that the state has no role in enforcing religious tenets within a congregation. Now, that would seem obvious to us today, but think about it. It was revolutionary in Jewish history, because throughout Europe, when rabbinical courts were adjudicating disputes and civil disputes in the Jewish communities of the Pale and of the of the communities all through Europe, those rabbinical courts had a mandate from the secular authorities. The secular authorities, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or whatever, they gave the rabbinical courts the writ to enforce the law. So in America, changing that was very radical. And I need perhaps not remind you that there is a country today where the state gives the rabbinical authorities the right to enforce civil law. Does anyone know what country that is? So I think that's one of the things that makes American Judaism distinctive. So I want to come back to reprise some of the main themes of my book of why this happened. It happened for three main reasons. First, it happened for practical reasons. The Jews who came to the United States, as many of you know, the first Jews who came here to these shores came in the 1650s, very early on in the colonial era, when they escaped from, they fled persecution in Brazil. And historians are not quite sure whether they landed in New York, which was then New Amsterdam, by accident or whether it was on purpose. They weren't especially welcomed. The ship's captain said that he wasn't going to take them any further, so he said to Peter Stuyvesant, "They're yours." They had a problematical beginning because Stuyvesant was virulently anti-Semitic, but fortunately the Dutch Indies companies had a lot of Jews as financiers, so he was persuaded that the Jews could be an asset. But the succession of Jews after that first migration, mostly starting in the 1840s, came from German-speaking countries. Germany didn't exist as a country until later in the 19th century. Many of them became peddlers, but even starting in the colonial era, there were practical reasons why it was difficult to hold on to Jewish customs. They wanted to do business, so dressing like they were aliens didn't seem like a good idea. It was obviously very difficult to keep kosher if you were a peddler going around the country. It was hard to, keep the dietary rules. It was difficult for shopkeepers to keep to close their shops on Sabbath, because there are many communities, they also had to close them on Sundays, so it was hard for them to make a living. So the first reason why Jews adapted to American, to a more secular version of themselves was practical. And if you read through the scholarship, including the scholarship of the great Jacob Rader Marcus, who Rabbi Lustig's mentor, he has a book where he quotes a lot of these great letters that went back and forth between Jewish immigrants and their families back in the old country. They're very beautiful, they're very moving, where the families begged their sons, mostly, sons and daughters, not to abandon their Jewish traditions, not to cut their beards, not to comb their, have short haircuts. And many Jews did keep their traditions, but many didn't. And of course there was intermarriage, and as they integrated more into society, their traditional clothing, their practices, their obligations to pray and daven 3 times a day and do all those things slipped away because it was just hard. And it was a lonely life that they led. So the second reason why Jews changed in the 19th century was kind of intellectual, but really, and this is a challenge that faced Protestantism as well, which was the advent of science, geology, paleontology, astrophysics. All of these things made it very difficult for intellectuals in the 19th century who were of religious faith to abandon the idea that the Bible should be taken literally. Now, those of you who are, many here are very knowledgeable about rabbinic Judaism, and there is, through the course of the millennia of commentary on the Torah and in the Talmud, there is an awareness, and Maimonides was especially one of these, of that the contradictions and that there were things in the Torah that just didn't make sense. If the Torah is the word of God, every word handed to Moses, how is it that Moses was able to describe his own death at the end of the Torah? There were tortured explications of Scripture throughout history, but I think in the 19th century, not only did these other intellectual awakenings of science arise, but also the science, if you will, of literary criticism, the discovery, especially, that there were other texts from Mesopotamia that were very similar to the Bible, and the biblical stories, and there were the German scholars who posited the idea that there were 4 or a select number of writers of the Torah because God is referred to in different ways in different sections. So they began developing this idea that this was a text written and selected by human beings, and this led to a kind of redefinition of what it was to be Jewish. That really is what our heritage is today. And I just found it very interesting in pursuing these stories that Protestants, and we know this, right? That the birth of literary criticism of the Bible really began a lot with Protestant scholars who studied Hebrew, who thought, well, if I'm going to really understand Scripture, I should learn Hebrew. So that a lot of the Protestant scholars in Germany learned Hebrew and analyzed, the voice of the texts. And of course, this happened in this country as well. My alma mater, Yale, was one of the first places that required Hebrew from their then President Ezra Stiles, who was from Newport, Rhode Island originally, and dates from the period when George Washington was communicating with the congregation in Newport. So so that's the second reason, is intellectual. Now the third reason, of course, that Jews in America changed the nature of their Judaism was that they wanted to become Americans. They wanted to Americanize Judaism. And that's what I mentioned earlier that Isaac Mayer Wise wanted to do. So they introduced, at this time, features in the service. They introduced sermons. They abandoned mixed seating, which, of course, changed radically the whole nature of the relationship between the family and the synagogue. If families sit together in a synagogue, it becomes just there's a different ethos. And this really, there's a lot of evidence that Jews changed these practices because they wanted to become more like their Protestant neighbors. They wanted their Protestant neighbors to feel that Judaism was an equal religion like theirs. The idea that we're, both children, that the heritage from Abraham was something that Jews and Christians could share. And so other innovations like the organ, which I mentioned before, which was very controversial, but obviously it was done because churches, that was a church-like thing. And of course, people opposed it precisely because it was a practice in churches. In fact, the main reason for the opposition to the organ is a passage from, I think it's Leviticus, about you shall not walk in their ways, which is that if the Goyim do it, you shouldn't do it. That was the basic principle. Another thing that was very American, there are two more things that were very American about Judaism in the 19th century. One was this idea of democratization, that it would be up to each congregation to decide what their practices were going to be. That they, and as I was suggesting before, think about it, how revolutionary this was. And also, Judaism, the idea of Judaism as a hierarchical religious structure was just not going to work in America. I mean, there were certainly rabbis who recommended themselves and thought they should be the chief rabbi in America or the chief rabbi in New York. And there are some kind of hilarious stories about people who offered themselves to be chief rabbi, and they mostly ended pretty badly for that rabbi. But can you imagine the existence of a chief rabbi in America today? It just doesn't, it's hard enough to be the rabbi of each congregation. So that was not going to work. And there was this democratic spirit that came into American Judaism, and that became another feature of how Americans Americanized the Judaism. But the other, of course, feature that I like to say is very American about American Judaism is that it split into factions. I mean, there exist tiny little reform and conservative congregations in other countries, including Israel, but in America, things split apart. Now, it took time for the reformers, as it were, to establish themselves. And then there was a counter-reaction, and maybe another of my favorite stories in the book, which is more familiar to a lot of people, which was in the 1880s when Hebrew Union College, which had just been established earlier by Isaac Mayer Wise and was the first seminary for rabbis in America, graduated their first rabbinical students who were ordained in Cincinnati in the 1880s, 1883, I think. And so Wise invited rabbis from all over the country, traditional and non-traditional alike, and other clergy. Hundreds of them came to Cincinnati for the first ordination of American rabbis, and then they had a big banquet later in the day, and it was a big feast, and the caterer was a friend of the leader of the Jewish community in Cincinnati, and out came one of the first courses at the banquet, and it was clams and shrimp and frog's legs, which are also treif. It became known as the treif banquet. And the rabbis at the conservative rabbis were outraged. A couple of them stalked out. There's a big scholarly debate about whether this was a mistake or whether it was Wise being perversely, heretical in his own way. He, at times, said it was a mistake. Other times he said, what's the big deal? It was much ado about nothing. He said, I don't believe in stomach Judaism. And right around then, not because of this event, but it became kind of a symbolic moment, there was a big counter-reaction, and shortly thereafter, the Jews, leading Jews in New York, decided to establish their own seminary, which is the Jewish Theological Seminary. Today, it's the leading conservative seminary. So what I wanted to show in this book was that the splitting apart of Judaism into factions is actually very American. Just think about it, how bewildered maybe some of us are by our non-Jewish friends explaining, what the Presbyterians believe versus the Methodists versus the Baptists. I mean, Tocqueville, when he came to America in the 1830s, was struck by two things. One was how religious Americans were. He said it was the most religious place that he had ever been, but he also was absolutely bewildered by the number of different Protestant sects that everybody had their own. I mean, I'm from France. We have the Catholics. That's it, But in America, there was a splitting apart. So that was also another American, maybe perhaps not intentional, American thing about Judaism. Another thing that interested me and that I write about in the book is the Civil War, which was a very important moment in American Judaism because Jews really served in very big numbers. There was conscription during the Civil War, but Jews enlisted or were drafted and served on both sides of the Civil War, and were were integrated into American society in probably more dramatic ways than had ever existed before. It was sort of like, we think that I think many of us think of World War II as a time when, in the modern era, Jews were integrated into American society. And historians say that the fact that Jews in the South were loyal to the Confederacy and Jews in the North were ferociously loyal to the Union, that this was another sign of Jews wanting to show themselves as American citizens and be loyal. But they also were divided over the issue of slavery, and I found that very interesting to explore because, again, it was another case of whether or not you take text literally or, the Bible has many instances of slavery that seem to be, or that are written about in a kind of approving way, and that for sure the Jewish law governs how you should treat your slaves, although there's a bit disagreement about what kind of slaves they were. They could have, were not the same kind of slaves that African Americans were in the 19th century, but there were Talmudic, if you will, arguments about slavery among Jews, and this was a real turning point to how Jews thought about whether they should be governed by text. But there was also, along with the integration of Jews into American society, there was a recrudescence of anti-Semitism, and the most famous being General Grant's Order Number 11, which banned Jews from certain occupied territories. And this was significant, too, because the Jews stood up and protested, and some of those who were evicted from areas in Kentucky that Grant had just occupied during the war went to President Lincoln and got him to rescind the order. So this was a very significant moment. Jews initially did not want to be, it was part of their desire to be integrated. They didn't want to be lobbying the government as Jews. They wanted to have views as individual citizens, but they didn't want the Jews to be seen as a lobbying force. But the Grant's order and other episodes like it led them to change their minds about that. I want to close by talking about returning again to the subject of the Messiah, which for me is a symbolically beautiful and important moment in American Jewish history, because when the Jews abandoned the idea of a personal Messiah, as the phrase goes, to come and redeem the world and lead us to the promised land, they did not abandon the vision in the prophets of a one day of everyone sitting under his own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid, which are lines from the prophets that the Jews of Newport incorporated in their invitation letter to George Washington, and which he incorporated in his letter back to them in that beautiful letter from 1790 of President Washington to the Jews of Newport. But the difference was that in the 19th century, the Jews came to believe that that era of redemption, which they prayed for, was something that it was up to human beings to work for, that it was going to be human agency that would deliver us to this beautiful era of peace and livelihood. And in this transformation of the belief, and you can see this in the great documents throughout the 19th century whenever there would be rabbinical conferences, and it culminated in the 1880s in the Pittsburgh Platform, but it runs all through the 19th century. In Chicago Sinai, where I spoke earlier this year, the rabbis there declared, "We believe that Jews themselves are a messianic people. There was always a tortured history throughout Judaism that exists today about our special status. Are we a chosen people? And if so, why? Or what makes us special? And there was a kind of evolution that really all of us are familiar with today when we deal with these issues of tikkun olam and social justice, which I know is such an important part of this congregation, that the birth of this idea of the Jews being a people who were chosen by God to set an example, not to proselytize, but to set an example of virtuous behavior and to bring about social justice through their actions. And although this remains a controversial topic in many communities, maybe even this one, about exactly what that means. Does it mean, supporting the labor movement as happened, in the early 20th century when many Jews thought that that was part of Judaism? Does it mean just doing charitable things? Does it mean feeding the homeless? Or does it mean some broader sense of social justice that we should bring about? What's interesting to me that as I said, it's rooted in this beautiful, it's rooted in the prophets. It's rooted in the prophets. These are the most beautiful parts of all literature, I think. It's no exaggeration to say. That vision and that idea that it's Jews who have a mission, perhaps conferred by God or just by tradition, to work on behalf of that vision. That was, you can read the literature of the 19th century of these Jews who were struggling with their identity, and you can see the birth of this idea that is with us today. And I found that very moving and beautiful. So I think that what I'd like to do is conclude there and invite your questions and have a conversation. I'm sure a lot of you have your own experiences and thoughts, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Just for a moment, and we'll move to the questions. You can leave all that. You'll come. So we want to thank you so much for this presentation, and just to emphasize your point about that transition of the idea that no Messiah was really that America was the promised land and the incarnation of the Messiah. In 1903, the coming of our own Rabbi Abram Simon, who became the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, who was in the booming metropolis in Nebraska, had an article that was published in the Sacramento paper, which made its way to the East Coast. And the quote that got Simon his job, or was picked up by the hiring committee here at Washington Hebrew, was America was the golden Medina, and it was the promised land. And so just to emphasize, we thank you for this. It leads to many, many questions. In just a moment, we'll turn it over and let you, we'll pass through and let you, we'll pass a microphone around, and we'll allow people to have questions. Before we do that, I want to invite Leslie Maitland, not only a colleague of our speaker, but also to tell you, as the chair of our Amram Scholar Series, what's yet to come. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, Steve. I must say, if Steve was surprised to see me in New York at the Jewish Book Council, I was equally surprised to see him, because of all the years we had sat right near each other in the Washington Bureau of the Times, and I had watched him churn out these terrific front-page stories on economics and other things. I had no idea that he was such an erudite scholar of Jewish history. So this is really fascinating, fascinating material here. And I urge you all to pick up a copy of The Chosen Wars. So turning from the past to the future, our Our next speaker will be on Sunday, March 31st at 10:30 a.m. Tal Kainan, a dynamic American-born financier who became an Israeli fighter pilot and then went on to build a highly successful career as a financier in New York and Tel Aviv, will speak about the survival of Judaism. The author of God is in the Crowd, 21st Century Judaism. He presents a really provocative blueprint for reversing the alarming decrease in worldwide Jewish population. He's a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, a director of the Steinhardt Foundation, and if you know any millennials, bring them in here because he really is a charismatic speaker on the future of the Jewish faith. After that, we will have two speakers on April 28th, again Sunday morning, when we'll look at the late Nobel laureate, author, and activist Elie Wiesel, who himself spoke in the Scholar Series not so many years ago. And he'll be the focus of Rabbi Ariel Berger, his former teaching assistant at Boston University, will speak about him, along with Nadine Epstein, the editor-in-chief of Moment magazine, which Wiesel helped to found in 1975. They'll be here together discussing his career. And our season closing reception this year will take place on a Wednesday evening, May 15th at 7 p.m. At this time of extreme political polarization, we will have the activist and CNN commentator Sally Cohn present The Opposite of Hate, a field guide to repairing our humanity. Exploring the ugliness erupting around us, she'll try to find a way to answer it. So now pick up a copy of our calendar outside in the atrium where Steve will be signing his book. Please do join us, and now hit him up with some good questions.
So we're going to let the questions flow.
I'm going to do something very un-Jewish and start with disagreeing with you on a small point and asking for your comment. Is this one on? Okay.
Is this on
So
also?
we talk a lot, you talked a lot, and it is a theme of Jewish history in America, that we were unusually split. We were democratic, and therefore we are a source of the splits in American in Jewish tradition. And you told the story, the great story of the Treffica banquet and all that. But I only learned, and if you don't know this story, you'll love it. I only learned a lot of that stuff comes from Germany, where, as the German Jews, the 250,000 you talked about, came here and brought their splits with them. So much of the ferment of Charleston and then New York and Albany, I guess, has roots in Germany. And here's one that traces directly to one of your stories. In 1869, the Neues Alte Synagogue in Berlin decided to bring in an organ. And the traditional Jews were outraged, and they marched out and walked down the street and formed a new congregation, Adas Yisrael. And I, for one, I have no evidence of this beyond that fact, but I suspect that the choice of name in Washington in 1869 which came a few months later, was a direct consequence of that. So my point is, and sort of an asking for a little commentary by you, is that it is absolutely true that America was a particularly fertile ground for this kind of development and multiplicity and constant fractionalizing. But in the Jewish community, at least, a lot of that comes from Bavaria and Berlin in the 1850s and 60s.
Right. Is this working?
It's working.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back.
This probably is better, so it won't give you any problem. Go ahead.
Yeah. So
Oops, we're caught on a button.
So
That's from the 1850s. No.
So you're quite right, but I thought about this quite deeply and read a lot of the scholarship from the era, and there is a perception among many of us that I went into this book with, which is that the reform movement in America was just an adaptation of what was going on in Germany. And I don't think it was that simple. I mean, they were parallel. The organ controversy that you cited actually came after the one in South Carolina, if you have your dates right, which I'm less familiar with. But David Ellenson, the revered scholar of the Reform movement of Hebrew Union College, and well, he's considered Reform, but he's actually he's a great scholar of traditional Judaism. Wrote an interesting essay that I drew from about the organ controversy in Europe, and it actually started much earlier, and there were controversies all over German-speaking countries. How much that the Jews of South Carolina and America were aware of these is less well documented. And so I think I have tried to avoid what I think it may be an oversimplification, that what was happening in America was just a response to what was happening in the German territory lands. And I think that, as I tried to say in my talk, the Reform movement or the changes in America were driven by American factors that were much more important than what was going on in Germany.
And I think you also make the point in your book, which you echo Dr. Marcus's point, that even though that they may have been influenced by the fact that, and your naming piece of it is critical, because Marcus takes on the point which you bring out, that 90% of the congregations that were created in America had the word shalom in the name, which was an idea of trying to heal the differences that maybe they inherited, and yet they continue on. Before we take, and I'm going to walk this to Ed back in the back, I want to ask you a question of
Sure.
whether what you see as the democratization and the things that happen as an intellectual, did these changes really, were they inspired intellectually, or was it the fact that they felt a salutary neglect, that the laws were just no longer applicable, people just didn't follow them, and they remained on the books, like, you know, it's illegal to wear pants 30 feet from the Capitol, you know, for a woman, but it's not enforced, it falls to salutary neglect. How much of what happened was intellectual, and how much was what was reflective of what was done? And I'm going to walk this back.
Well, in writing history, I think it's always a challenge to disaggregate the factors that are involved in historical change. So that's a way of just punting on your question, quite frankly, because I don't know the answer to that. I think it was both. I think that among some it was salutary neglect. That's a nice phrase. I'm unfamiliar with it. But and but I was when you read the debates in which was the most fun part of my book. You know, we were talking before that there's just a ton of really great historians who have written about this period, but they only, you know, I would always read those books and then go to the footnotes and then go to the original documents and read the debates. And when you read the debates, the intellectual arguments are what fascinated me. So that's partly why I dealt with them.
When you speak about the tranquil banquet, I thought you did a really nice job of balancing between, when you talk about Weisman's vacillation, he vacillated at times because what he was saying was, what does it really matter? Because this reflects the reality of the Jewish community today. Ed.
Thank you, Rabbi. Let's take it. Steve, thank you.
Hello, Ed.
How are you? Nice to see you, and congratulations on this book.
We're neighbors.
Yes, exactly. I'm excited to read your book, Steve, and thank you so much. Mazel tov.
Thank you.
The theme of the book, is, as you present it, seems to be this splitting apart of the American Jewish community, the Chosen Wars, and you use the term splitting apart. And I'm wondering if you could take us to the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. And my question is, have those two singular events in Jewish history been countervailing, unifying factors overall in American Judaism? And if you would, even take us to the present day, and maybe some of the controversies over Israeli policies and how that plays out in our American Jewish communities? Thank you.
Excellent question. How much time do you have? I think that pendulum of Jewish history, like all histories, swings back and forth. So for those of us who have lived through, or whose parents survived or lived through the Holocaust and studied the Holocaust, and then the creation of the miracle of Israel, and then the 67 war, especially these unified Jews over Israel in a way that had never happened before. I mean, when the creation of Zionism was a controversial issue among Jews, it was unthinkable, of course, in the 19th century. Zionism grew up toward the end of the 19th century with Herzl and the Balfour Declaration, in the early 20th century and the Versailles Conference after World War I. Jews were not necessarily, as I understand it, in the early 20th century against a homeland for the Jews, but they did not see it as something for them. They saw it for the impoverished and persecuted Jews of Europe. And of course, as they flooded into the United States, Jews in America had mixed feelings about the influence that they were going to have on America. And then you go into the 40s and 50s, where Jews were tortured over the creation of the State of Israel. And my beloved New York Times, as many of you know, was one of those places that was not especially sympathetic to the creation of the State of Israel. So then Jews became more Zionist, as Ed said, because of the recognition of the disaster of World War II and the fact that when Israel was created, it was immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors. And of course, we're evolving again now with many American Jews uncomfortable with the policies being carried out by recent governments in Israel. And of course, I didn't bring my 10-foot pole today, so I'm not going to touch that one. But I'm joking. I mean, it's what we wrestle with today as Jews, as American Jews. And the discomfort that Jews in America have with Israeli policies are not just political, as you know. They're also the relationship to the rabbinic establishment and the role of women at the wall and all of that. And I've spoken at a number of synagogues about this book. It's been a great privilege and an honor. It's always been interesting. This always comes up. But the most interesting thing was I went down to a synagogue in Jupiter, Florida, of all places. And the rabbi there is from Israel, and he grew up in an Orthodox family and became disillusioned with Israel when he went into the army with the Orthodox establishment. Decided to come to America, studied at Hebrew Union College, went back to Israel to try and have a Reform congregation, and he just said, I gave up. He said, it was just, not that I couldn't do it, have a Reform congregation in Israel, it's just that it was too divisive. I just didn't want to increase the divisiveness in the Jewish community by, I mean, I'm sure he supports the women at the wall and all of that, but it's just, he just didn't want to do that. So he said to me, I think you're right that Judaism in America is an American religion. So let me just say that one of the things I wanted to do, where'd you go? You're back there. one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to write about conflict in Jewish history, to remind everybody that the history of Judaism is the history of conflict in Judaism. I mean, whether it was the Sadducees and the Pharisees and rabbinic, the evolution of rabbinic Judaism, and then the Karaites and the Maccabees, and the Hellenizers, we've been struggling over this, we Jews, throughout our history. So I just got the review of my book in the American Jewish Archives Journal, and the author shared the review with me and asked if I had any comments, which was unheard of in my... and she said but she seemed to say that I was overly optimistic, that I sounded an optimistic tone in my book. And I guess I plead a little guilty to that, because I just think if we understand that we have a history of conflicts, maybe it'll help us realize that we can get through our conflicts today.
One of the things, if I may make a quick comment, that I think
Please.
that is so important about your book that you do, and that answers gets to present day, is you really establish in such a profound way what I think has happened, and that is that the American Jewish community tethered itself to democracy, to the concepts in all of those things that we want to do, to Americanize and do, in the way that we were, the symbiotic relationship between being American citizens and the way we politically operated and doing things, we were tethered to that American Judaism was part and parcel. This is where Alvin Reines creates the concept of polidoxy, which takes that same concept out of the historical and puts it into a theological concept. Because of that, that has created the great divide between us, because the Zionism today in Israel is tethered not as much to democracy as we'd like to, but to nation state and to the particularism of nation state. And so we have the classical conflict that you describe at the beginning between the traditionalist and the non-traditional. Would we be an American, or would we do this? And that's a brilliant young guy by the name of Eli Weinstock has got an article that's coming out. I think it'll be out tomorrow or the next day. I pre-read it, which is all about does America have the right to comment on the Israeli elections? And Eli's answer in terms of that is that we don't have a right to comment on politics. We do have a right to comment on how the Israeli elections affect Judaism.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great distinction. Let's take another, Marcia?
Can I just add
Please,
something before
answer.
that? Yeah, I think that you make a profoundly important and interesting point. So when I was an editorial writer at the New York Times... and charming. No, I must say that I'm so moved by your comments. Thank you. When I was an editorial writer at the New York Times in the 1990s, I used to write about these issues, and people would say, "What is the New York Times? Why are you writing about these issues of religion?" I wrote supporting the women at the wall or whatever, and separation of church and state, if you can use that phrase, in Israel. And I used to say, well, I'm never going to tell Jews what they should think, but I think the New York Times has the right to tell the state of Israel what kind of a state to be. So I think we as American Jews do have the right to comment on these issues, but I really worry about the divide now between Israel and the American Jewish community. Please. And then we'll go here.
Oh, I'm sorry. When I was a girl growing up in a synagogue very much like this, a temple, classical reform.
There's no one like this.
And in the 50s and 60s, we were schooled in the thought that we were not so much the chosen people, but we were the choosing people. We took God's bargain and became God's partners in tikkun olam, social justice. I wonder if it partly was that the assimilation of the 50s and 60s after the war, and has it fallen from favor now? Are we back to being chosen? We didn't want to be special in that way.
Well, it's an interesting question. There's that old song, how odd of God to choose the Jews. It's not so odd the Jews chose God. But I think that although tikkun olam and social justice, the polls show that most American Jews do feel that that's a central tenet of Judaism, although not all. Some are offended by that because they don't see it as a religious issue. But I think that, I lost my train of thought, the concept of social justice is, well, let me go back to your question. The idea of chosenness is an agonizing one for us. And I think, Bruce, you were saying that you were giving a talk or had a series of lectures coming up on Jewish identity. So I think that what we are seeing, especially in the Reform movement, is that Judaism cannot just be a set of universalist religious beliefs and beliefs in social justice. I think for many of us, we still embrace tradition and our identity somehow as a people, and we're struggling to define it in the modern world that isn't offensive to our fellow Americans or offensive to us. And this sense of our unique tradition, I think it's why we turn to our history, because we want to remind ourselves that we are who we are today because of this history as a people. And I'm not sure, I think each individual deals with it in his or her own way. But the more, as I grow older and have raised children and tried to teach them what Judaism is, and to do it by example and not just sending them off to Sunday school and having them bar and bat mitzvahed, I realize that there are certain things that I do that are just a ritual and a tradition. I put on my father's ring every day, and we can all think of things that we do that tie us to the past. So I think that the idea of us as a people, whether or not we're chosen or we choose ourselves, we choose our own path toward God, is something that actually American Judaism is right now very dynamically rediscovering. So although there's lots written about the coming oblivion of American Jews, and certainly in Israel, they think, many of them, that the American Jewish community is dying out, and when something horrible like Pittsburgh happens, or when the murders in France take place, everybody in Israel, not everybody, but so many say, aha, there's no place for Jews except in Israel. I think that American Judaism is now in a very dynamic phase. It is struggling to bring in the next generation, but I think that part of that struggle in redefinition is bringing these rituals and sense of peoplehood back into the fray in a way that was abandoned by the Jews of the 19th century. The pendulum is swinging back. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
I doubt that. I actually have a joint. My mom and I have we have a joint question, but it's about the thesis of the distinctiveness of the American Jewish community, and we want to press you on similarities and differences between two other Anglophone countries. That is to say, our neighbor to the north, Canada, and England. Canada and most major American Jewish organizations now are North American Jewish organizations, but the religious demography of Canada is profoundly different. It's much more orthodox, much more conservative than American Judaism. And what did you want to ask about British?
It's essentially the same question, right? And taking it further, in the UK, you do have a chief rabbi. So you developed a very different structure, right, than we developed, right, with not necessarily that different a set of secular commitments. So it's the same question. What is it, in your view, since you've looked so hard at the American experience, that makes our experience, the American Jewish experience, so different from the Canadian Jewish experience or the British Jewish experience? Or is it? Maybe we're wrong.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with the English British Jewish experience, and even less so with the Canadian Jewish, although I'm familiar with the great, well-known philanthropic families in Canada who are traditional, and I've read, a couple novels of Mordecai Richler, and that's my familiarity with Canadian Jews. So I confess I'm not, I don't know the answer to that. But you're right that is there a chief rabbi in Canada? I don't think so. Yeah, but there is in England. What's his name?
Jonathan Sachs.
Jonathan Sachs is the best known of the former chief rabbis. Let me please indulge me, and I'll tell a story. I hope Stu Eisenstadt doesn't mind my telling this story. So he told me recently that he invited Jonathan Sachs to give a lecture in Atlanta in honor of Fran, his wife, his late wife. He set up a lecture series. Did you know this story?
No, but we have our own story.
And he agreed to do it. And so there was going to be in Atlanta at a conservative synagogue, and at the last minute, Rabbi Sachs dropped out and said, "I cannot come to speak at that because it's not an Orthodox synagogue." And he, really? Same thing here. And Stu said, "What are you talking about? You're the chief rabbi. That means you're the rabbi of all the Jews." And he finally said, according to Stu, and also Stu said, "This is not a service. It's just the venue where you're going to speak." And he still begged off. So there you have it. I mean, the old joke in Israel is that for Israelis, the Orthodox synagogue is the one that they don't go to. That most Israelis are, not that observant or not that traditional in their whole lifestyle, but they do go to the Orthodox synagogue. And I think that's true of the Jews in England who I know, and I don't know that many, but I've known many over the years.
I mean, Sachs would not attend Hugo Green's funeral, which was, there was a whole controversy, and unfortunately wrote a note that was in Hebrew that didn't realize that other people would be able to read, and it was controversial. But I think one of the things that, if I might say this in the book, that he does talk about the uniqueness of this, is the fact that the development of these controversies that came and the constellation of those with these dynamic leaders, with David Einhorn, Isaac Mayer Wise, Lester, other things where there were leaders in other places, but the unique situation of the blend between the intellectual, the actual responding to what was going on in the country, and the unique nature of democracy in America and the preservation of the separation of church and state, which allowed us to flourish in a way with a dynamic that was very different because we weren't controlled by a chief rabbi. There weren't things put on. So we had a spectrum and have a spectrum in America, even amongst. So when Isaac Mayer Wise creates the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, now affectionately known as the URJ, there is a set of bylaws and things that happen that are suggested. There's nothing that holds a person to that until there's certain situations. And in the 1950s, Gerstenfeld borderlined on being kicked out of things because he was playing with the Committee for American Judaism, which was, the idea that Israel, being anti-Israel, that it was anti-Jewish to believe and would hurt the American Jewish community. So I think that there are some things that it's an absolute excellent question. And the dynamics of the difference between North America in terms of Canada, it is the development of Canadian Jewry is totally different. It is much more European and progressive Judaism because they did not believe that the great center of Judaism would be America. They thought it was still going to be Europe. And because of it, the shift was a historical shift, which was because of the Holocaust, not really because we did anything such grander. Yes, sir.
In contrast to the intellectual questions, I have two simplistic ones. First of all, in your book...
Those are always the most complex.
In your book, do you cover the modern splitting, such as the ethical, cultural, and the other? And the second is Reconstructionist Judaism. Where did that come from? Conservative or Reform?
So the first question was about ethical culture, and that I do cover in the book, which is fascinating to me because Isaac Mayer Wise was a member of something called the Free Religious Association, which was headed by Felix Adler, who really was supposed to become the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in New York until he came back from Europe and basically renounced Judaism. I mean, he sort of became an atheist. And so he and Wise split, and there was a big division over the feeling that Felix Adler had just taken Reform Judaism and fallen off the cliff with it and gone too far. But and in terms of Reconstructionism, that's a 20th century phenomenon. I am not an expert on that, but it really Mordecai Kaplan was really very much of a traditionalist, I think, when he embraced Reconstructionism, which was a definitional thing of Jewish civilization that he wanted to teach. He was excommunicated by the Orthodox establishment in the, when was it, in the 20s, I think? And I know less about that. And a lot of people have said to me, well, why don't you write another book about 20th century divisions? And thank you very much. I don't have any plans to do that, at least for the time being.
So I'm going to skirt out in a minute. I want to give my personal thanks. I also want to give a personal endurance. This right now in our time in history, for those who are not versed in the transitions that took place during the 18th and 19th centuries, this is a critical read. This book has been mentioned, and I called Leslie up and immediately, but then I turned my text. She got to me before. 3 or 4 of the books that Leslie has picked have been books that have been referred to in articles that are on the issue of intersectionality in Judaism, the marginalization of Judaism, the American Judaism. So this is a critical book. It has been, others in the news have found it. I want to thank Leslie for bringing this to it, and I'm going to skirt out to go to do another event and give Leslie the last questions, and also our profound thanks for all that you do for the Amram.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I do have one closing question. I must say, when I was younger, I used to think that I was a Jewish American. That is, an American who happened to be a Jew. The progression, I would say, of my understanding of life and history, particularly as the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and more recently seeing the resurgence, unfortunately, of anti-Semitism even in this country, has gradually shifted my perception over time to make me think of myself more as an American Jew, so that the noun is the Jew, the American becomes a modifier. And so I've given a lot of thought to this question, have debated it with friends and other things. I once got into a big argument with this with his name, Aaron Miller from Seeds of Peace. He disagreed with me, but I really wonder about that. Are we Jewish Americans, Americans being our primary identity, Jewish the modifier, or does the history of the Jewish people over time reassert itself to remind us over and over and again, as it did to my grandparents in Germany and then to France when they fled there, that no, we are Jews first. And we may not notice that or affirm that, but the rest of the world sure does. And I wonder, in your examination of Jewish history in the period that you particularly focused on, was that something that they wrestled with as they came to this country? Would they be Jewish Americans, or would they be American Jews? So I think that's a good place to sort of wrap up.
Thank you. Well, I think they primarily did see themselves as Jewish Americans, and the whole desire to put forward the idea that Judaism was a religion, a sister or a brother religion to Christianity, was part of that. That our religions are similar and we're all Americans. To answer the question personally, I think I do see myself as a Jewish American rather than American Jew, but obviously, depending on the context, it's a tough one. I don't know how much longer we can try the patience of this audience, Leslie.
I think that's probably it, unless there's one more pressing question from anybody.
Not a question, but a comment. Earlier in your talk, you commented on what transpired in the Civil War with Ulysses Grant. Well, I wasn't there, so I couldn't comment on that. But I was involved in World War II,
Yeah.
and I think that World War II, as other world wars, are very democratizing. But the first 25 years of my life, I was an Orthodox Jew. I went on the bus to go to the induction center, and they gave me a ham and cheese sandwich on white bread. I asked for a pastrami on rye, but I didn't get it. But it was very democratizing, and I'm just allude to this same comment. A dear friend of ours in the building where we live was a naval aviator in the Vietnam War, and he's practicing Orthodox Jew. Even today, he goes to Adas, Israel, every morning and says, lays tefillin and does the whole thing with the Orthodoxy. But democracy is democratic practices like wars tend to change our behavior, not necessarily because we want it, but we have to make the adjustment.
Thank you, Lou.
That's a very nice comment. I think I agree with it. Anyway, I want to thank you all very much for coming out and listening and asking good questions. And as previously said, I'll be signing books if you would like to do that. And really, it's been a great honor to be here at this beautiful and historic synagogue and congregation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve.